Okay, hi everyone, I'm a PhD student at UCL and I'm going to be talking to you about the challenges of testing social interaction in isolation and how we overcame those challenges. So briefly for context, my research looks at voices, and voices are obviously a key part of our self-identity. They not only have great personal importance to us, but also great social importance, as it's through our voice that we share ourselves with others and achieve our social and communicative goals. So broadly, my research asks questions like, well, are we biased towards our own voice because it's a voice that belongs to us? And can we actually give people a new voice that isn't actually their own voice inherently, but get them to associate that voice to themselves and then show a bias for it? And how much of this bias is affected by whether or not they've had a chance to use the voice socially, given how important voices are to our social interactions? So the first sort of part of my PhD looked to answer the first two of these questions. And we can see here from the results that when we give people a new voice, simply by telling them that this new voice is now yours, this voice belongs to you, we see that reaction times to that voice are significantly quicker than the reaction times to a voice we tell them belong to a friend or a voice we tell them belongs to a stranger. And the fact that this voice, the self voice, is being perceived more quickly than either of the other two voices is purely because this voice has now been deemed to be a more self-relevant stimulus than either of the other two voices. And as it becomes more self-relevant, it accrues a processing advantage that prioritizes it in our perception. So this was done via a perceptual matching paradigm in Gorilla, which people can use via Gorilla open materials if they want to try it. But the question then became, well, what about using this voice socially, rather than just giving participants a chance to hear the voice that we've suddenly told them is theirs and then measuring the bias towards it? What about if we give participants a chance to use that new voice and then measure how they perceive it? So that was the main sort of aim, but then the pandemic hit. So suddenly testing social interaction became very difficult. And the question really became, well, how can we create an online environment where people can interact using a new voice? And so my first top tip then is to collaborate where you can, because that's the only way that this got done. We were lucky to collaborate with academics that work in AI, Angus Addersley and Professor Bryony. And together we managed to build an online two-player game, combining our skills, and we were able to create this environment where we could host pairs of participants to come in, interact in a real life interaction and use a new voice that they'd chosen for themselves. Importantly, this new voice was a synthesized voice made by Cereproc Voices, and they create human sounding voices in a range of accents. And by using a synthesized voice in this task, it meant that we could provide participants with a huge amount of agency, not only in what the voice sounded like and what they wanted to be represented as, but also a huge amount of flexibility in what they wanted to say with that voice. The game itself that we created was called Drawing Conclusions, and that's because it took the form of a drawing game, and it looked something like this. This was created in a Node.js app. So the idea of the game was that pairs of participants would take on the role as either a narrator or an artist, and the narrator had to verbally describe to the artist how to draw a picture without telling the artist what it was that they were drawing. So this is the screen that the narrator would have seen, and it went something like this. The narrator would choose their synthesized voice from a drop-down menu, choose a picture from a picture deck that we supplied to them, and then they would try to type instructions to tell the artist how to draw that picture. Importantly, these written instructions were then said aloud in the text-to-speech voice that they had chosen for themselves. So it went something like that. The artist would then be able to hear the narrator's instructions and follow those instructions accordingly. And this process would happen iteratively until either the narrator was satisfied that the picture was complete, or until the artist had successfully guessed what it was that they'd drawn. So this was a bit like Pictionary, and actually was a very fun way of getting participants to interact with a real life human being, to achieve a social goal and achieve that goal by using the voice that they had just chosen for themselves. So we've got the game, we've got the environment. How do we get participants there? We had quite a complicated setup, especially as it needed to all be run remotely. We needed to start participants in Gorilla, which was our main test platform, getting them to choose a voice and answer questions like why they chose that voice for themselves. We then needed to get them through to the drawing platform, the game platform we created, and then back again to Gorilla to be able to answer questions about the bias towards that voice. And this is where the next tip comes in, which is really to manipulate the tools to your needs. The tools exist, you just have to figure out how to use them for the best. So Gorilla supplies a redirect node, which allows you to transfer participants from Gorilla out to a third-party platform, and then you can embed a link into that platform and send them back into Gorilla when you're done. And importantly, the participant starts where they left off, which is really helpful for sort of ensuring continuity between your tasks. It was also important to think about how we were going to recruit participants, how are we actually going to get participants to do the study at all. Ordinarily in person, we might be recruiting pairs of participants to come into the lab at preset times, but that again wasn't possible. So instead we recruited online via Prolific. And obviously Prolific is normally associated with the main benefit of recruiting hundreds of participants at once. But it's also worth saying that you can use Prolific to actually recruit very small and very controlled numbers at one time. So we started a Prolific study and we only opened up 2 available spaces. We then recruited participants 2 at a time into the drawing game. We allowed them to complete the study, and at that time it was paused in Prolific. And then we could gradually increase the places to another 2 participants. And this allowed it to be a very controlled way of getting participants through our study. We could track their progress through the study. And it also meant that if anybody withdrew from the study, we had an immediate pool of people that were ready to take over. So overall, I think in order to navigate people through multiple platforms on using different tools, it's really important to use really clear and well piloted instructions. We also use video instructions for things like explaining how to play the game before they got to the game platform. And videos instructions are just a really good way of getting people to listen to a lot of information in one go in a more engaging way. And it's also important that they actually can't skip past them in Gorilla, so they have to listen to them before they move on. So we've got the participants there. The next question was, well, how are we going to keep them there? This study was a very long study. It was about an hour long as a sort of an average, but some people took a lot longer. And to be honest, like the game was the fun half, and that was the first half. So how to keep people in your study after that, rather than just play the game and then go make a cup of tea. So firstly, we needed to make sure that it ran as smoothly as possible before we even begun. And obviously everyone has said pilot, 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 and that's very true. I also limit browsers. I find Chrome to be the least glitchy, especially when we're working across multiple platforms. Chrome presented the least amount of issues. If you're using auditory stimuli in a task, I sometimes find in Gorilla that the first auditory stimulus doesn't play or doesn't play quite on time, and that can throw participants off. So I actually use a dummy sound at the beginning of tasks that include auditory stimuli. And that dummy sound is normally just a period of silence that the participants don't even know has been included. But it means that by the time the first proper sound wants to play, it's ready to go and it runs more smoothly. I also make really good use of progress bars. Participants are really grateful to have progress bars in the study. And if I can't have a progress bar on screen because I don't want it to be there visually, I always tell participants how long the next section of the study is going to take. And if you've done all of those things, you should have good data, and you can see these are the results from my study. So here you can see that in the drawing game group, the people that chose a voice and played the game, they have prioritized the self voice significantly more in comparison to the other voices that they heard in that game. But actually, in comparison to a control group who just chose the voice and didn't play this game, the results are exactly the same. There's no significant difference. So here we can show that there is perceptual prioritization of voices that we own, or voices that we've used, but that prioritization isn't modulated by whether we've used them nor how we've used them in an interaction with another person. So thanks very much to my lab, to Angus Adelsey, to Sarah Proc for their synthesized voices, to Gorilla and Prolific. And if you've got any questions, please do drop me an email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bryony. If there are any questions for Bryony, do drop them in the Q&A. We have time to answer one now. Otherwise, it's going to be me asking the question. So okay, keep questions coming into the Q&A, and I'm going to quickly ask Bryony a question. So you talked about presenting sound in these sorts of paradigms. And obviously, there was a whole session yesterday when two people were talking about doing online testing with sound. So have there been any other issues that you've run into in presenting auditory stimuli online?
So I tried to create an intentional binding paradigm. Not sure if people here are familiar with that, but it relied on having very accurate onsets of time and offsets of time of auditory stimuli. And I actually found that the biggest issue with that was that some browsers present a lag between when Gorilla, for instance, tells you that the time has been started and when the browser has actually played it. And that's mostly why I use Chrome, because it seems to have the least variation across participants of when that time onset for the auditory stimulus has actually played. Whereas a browser, I think it was Safari, sometimes had up to 500 milliseconds of lag. And because my study relied on having a very accurate and precise measure of time in milliseconds, a bigger lag as that makes a big issue.
Yeah.
So I know that Gorilla has produced quite a lot of work and preprints about the timing accuracy of these things. But for the sake of minimizing that in my study, I always just use Chrome.
Thank you very much. I think there are some more questions coming in, but I'm going to say thank you very much to Bryony, but also to all our speakers in this opening session of Buffer of Online Research. And I'm going to hand back over to Joe. Thank you very much.